everyone. As people of the United States, I'm sure many of us have seen videos or body cam footage of police officers showing use of force on citizens. Some of these videos show perfect use of force procedures, while many will show excessive force and brutality. My name is Jordan Anderson, and as a military police officer of 5 years, I'm here to inform you about proper use of force procedures, including the preconditions, threat assessment, and important court cases. By the end of my speech, you will be knowledgeable on what is excessive force and what is appropriate. Use of force is defined as the means of compelling compliance or overcoming resistance to an officer's commands in order to protect life or property or to take a person into custody. There are 5 levels of use of force. Level 1 would be police presence. A lot of times, level 1 is all you need to de-escalate a situation. An example would be dispatch sending an officer to a protest. Now, most protests are peaceful, but they do have the potential to become violent and destructive. With the presence of an officer being there, protesters will be less inclined to escalate. Level 2 is verbalization or verbal commands. An example of this would simply be an officer telling protesters to disperse by a certain time. Level 3 is empty hand control. While making an arrest, an officer may have to get physical by grabbing the perpetrator or holding them to restrain them. Level 4 is less lethal methods. Examples of this would be a baton, taser, or pepper spray. An officer should never use these unless a perpetrator is getting physical or violent. Lastly, level 5 is lethal force. Lethal force should only be used if a suspect poses a serious threat to an officer or another individual. Now that we've gone over the 5 levels of use of force, we can learn about the 8 preconditions. In the military, police have 8 preconditions where lethal force is authorized. Officers should still try to de-escalate the situation, but in many cases it's not possible and it's just too dangerous. The 8 preconditions are as follows: self-defense, defense of others, assets vital to national security, national critical infrastructure, inherently dangerous properties, escape, apprehension, and arrest. Some of these are self-explanatory, such as self-defense and defense of others. However, some may be confusing. Assets vital to national security would be an example of nuclear weapons or restricted areas containing strategic operational assets. Destroying or tampering with this could be detrimental to national security, so therefore lethal force is authorized. National critical infrastructure would include a power plant or even a water tank. Destroying this would disrupt and harm the society, so therefore lethal force is authorized. Inherently dangerous properties would include weapon armories or a building that contains chemical or biological agents. A theft or break-in of this type of property can be incredibly dangerous to society if it's in the wrong hands. Escape can be tricky. Obviously, if a criminal escapes from prison, it doesn't mean an officer can immediately utilize lethal force. However, if an officer believes a criminal to be a serious threat to society and in result can reasonably justify the criminal will cause serious bodily harm or death to others, lethal force is authorized. Military police officer must have one of these 8 preconditions in order for lethal force to be used. There have been hundreds of instances of excessive force and police brutality. As a result, several Supreme Court cases have been made to protect U.S. citizens as well as police officers, so there is no confusion on what is appropriate and what isn't. A very important Supreme Court case would be Graham versus Connor. According to the Supreme Court in 1989, the primary holding was a claim of excessive force by law enforcement during an arrest, stop, or other seizure of an individual is suspect to the objective reasonableness standard of the Fourth Amendment rather than a substantive due process standard under the 14th Amendment. In other words, officers couldn't use force because of a hunch or a gut feeling, but rather because of objective reasonableness. Objective reasonableness means that it does not matter whether the officer themselves believe that the conduct was legal. Instead, the officer has to prove that a reasonable officer could have believed that the conduct was legal. Jeffrey P. Alpert, a criminology professor at the University of South Carolina, claims that permissible and impermissible force must be situationally appropriate rather than academically or judicially strained. This directly coincides with Graham versus Connor and holds officers accountable to ensure they don't use force without the ability to prove themselves. From this speech, you should have learned about the 5 levels of force, the 8 preconditions of lethal force, and Graham versus Connor. Now, when you watch body cam or cell phone footage of an interaction or an arrest, you can reasonably attest whether or not the officer is justified or not in the situation. I hope this briefing was helpful and beneficial to you, and I thank you for your time and attention. Thank you, everyone.